everyone? It's warm. And if you're not here or you're delaying us, I think this building's going to get warmer. The musicians have to have such that their hands can slide on the necks of their instruments. The violinists telling us about this. So is the cellist. So we have to have mercy. And my comments have to be brief, unless you get me going. Now, we were asked to dress formally for the event. For us, this is a formal event, and the reason I'm up here is to introduce you to why it's formal. We're pleased to have the neighbors from Schoharie County. Raise your hands, neighbors. Is Ed Sherlock here? Ed Sherlock? No? No Ed Sherlock. Ed Sherlock was our radio show host, and we had an interview also explaining what was going to happen today. So, since Ed isn't here, and since apparently none of you know about the radio, we can also go in that direction. The reason we wanted to have some comments before is because the event that we're marking today has to do with some history, and probably a history that many of you wouldn't know. Many of you may know some of it, many of you may know none of it, many of you may know all of it. So you can relax if you know all of it. The reason we have the musicians is because they're able to play for us many things, but especially some exquisite Russian music. Our pianist is Russian. She came from St. Petersburg, and that's a good part of our story. Our violinist is half Russian, and his helper, the cellist, he's not going to make any claims about that, but he knows Russian music. Now, the event we're celebrating happened 100 years ago. And we need to demonstrate why the event is broader than just a culture. And to introduce that idea, we're going to tell you a story, a true story, of an American who found himself in upstate New York. Here's upstate New York. Upstate New York is a big place. As anyone outside of the city will tell you, all of New York State is upstate New York. And when it comes to a vote, well, we know the city always wins. So here we are in upstate New York, and for some reason, the Russians took a great liking to upstate New York. Now, you might not know this, but you should know it now. We have our host. He's this man here, and we're going to ask him to stand up again. George Lukine forced me to do this because he claims he couldn't, but he's a host, and he wanted you to be here. He has purchased this property. If you notice the Onion Dome is significant of a church on the property, but it's also what George calls a Russian religious and cultural center. So today's event is both religious and cultural. But if you have no empathy with Russians, here's the story. There's another establishment here in upstate New York. It's not too far from Utica. It's called Jordanville, and there is actually a very famous, long-established Russian monastery there. If you haven't heard of it, you'll drive over there and have a look. And there was a young man who came to that monastery, and he wasn't Russian. And he had a conversation with people that was repeated so often that it really signified something to him about the way the culture works. It was back in the 1980s. Many people approached him and they said, "Oh, it's very nice you've come here. Are you interested in what we do?" And the answer was yes. And the monastery is an unusual place for an American to show up. And then the people would say, "Well, where do you come from?" And they'd say, "We come from the eastern portion of the United States." And they would say, "And your parents, what are their names?" And then the perplexity began. They'd say, "Well, your parents, they don't sound Russian." There was this pause, like this doubt. And then they said, "Well, how about your grandparents? Are they Russian?" No, they weren't Russian either. Surely, someone in your family is Russian. And you have to say, this young man had to say no. No one in his family is Russian. So why was he here? Because he felt something broader was going on than the culture. And that's what we're attempting to show you today. This event we're celebrating is very precious to those who know. And we wish all of you to know, but we also wish you to see it as broader. Now, if we ask you the nationality of the culture, for instance, of someone like the Apostle Paul or the Apostle Peter, most of you would probably have a strong feeling for their cultural attachment. You would say, well, they were apostles. They were bigger than culture. And you would be right. And the thing about a religious connection is that if we tie ourselves by our actions to a truth which is bigger than our culture, then like the apostles, we've stepped beyond the culture. Now, there is always a culture. Jesus Christ came from a certain country and he spoke a certain language, and so did the apostles. So there is still that attachment, but we wish you to see something more universal, something you can empathize with. And if not all that fails, then you still have beautiful music. The event was the murder of the Romanov family, the ruling emperor's family, in 1918, and it happened on our calendar on July 17th. 2 days hence, we felt most of you would be more willing to come today because it's a weekend. And on that July 17th, it was a summer day, just as it is here, perhaps not quite as warm, but it happened at night. In the royal family, we've all heard perhaps of Nicholas and Alexandra. They were famous some decades ago by a book with the same title and with a film with the same title. Nicholas and Alexandra and their 5 children, 4 daughters and 1 son, were taken to a basement and shot. All of them were executed. There was another American involved in the story, and when this event was celebrated by the Russians, his reaction was, well, perhaps there's a political tie-in. In other words, what do we think of we won't go to present conditions, present politics, but let's go into history. Let's go into American history. Let's talk about Abraham Lincoln. I think most people are comfortable with knowing who Abraham Lincoln is. And if you remember that he was shot in a theater on a Friday, actually it was Good Friday, a lot of people might use the term, he was sacrificed for the good of his nation. Unless we happen to be talking in South Carolina, perhaps, or Charleston, or Atlanta. You see, in other words, you see the difference between political evaluation, someone who was amazing politically, or perhaps beyond. I happen to be a big Abraham Lincoln fan. Or we see it as a limitation. And the thing about the royal family, the emperor and his wife, was that they were ruling an empire, and they were called autocrats. And this is a degree of control of an empire, of power, that was no longer matched anywhere else in the world, in Europe especially at the time. We think of Great Britain and King George and Queen Victoria. We think of the Kaiser in Germany. They were a ruling family, but none of them had the total power that Nicholas and his Empress Alexandra possessed. So when he bore the responsibility of this empire, and it was a very bad time, his grandfather had been blown up, executed. His father died at age 49. He was famous for being strong as an ox. No one expected him to die at age 49. Nicholas, therefore, son of the Emperor Alexander III, had to take over the throne at age 26. This would be crushing for most 26-year-olds. And one would say, well, he had ultimate power. That makes it easy. Or it makes one feel responsibility. The times were hard. There was agitation in all those years. That's why the grandfather had been blown up. He had been blown up by people who wished to overturn the regime. Whatever your opinion of who was right and who was wrong, who was strong and who was weak, it would be a very hard time to be running an empire. There was a revolution in 1905, and it forced Nicholas to establish a degree of what we would call a constitutional monarchy. It still wasn't matching what was constitutional in Britain, but it was beginning. And then, if that weren't hard enough, in 1914, and we hope all of you have a sense of what the Holocaust of World War I meant for Europe, where an entire generation was wiped out, and that was for all of Europe. If one pictures the entry of Russia into World War I, remember, they're always the guys on the other side of the problem, right? There's all quiet on the Western Front, but there was an Eastern Front, and it was disaster. All the young men who were out to be growing food were now at the front, and they weren't growing food, so there were food shortages. And Russia was a huge country, but it wasn't as industrialized, at least for munitions and war supplies, as Germany. So the war didn't go very well. As food shortages increased, as the wounded came back from the front, and they came back in increasing numbers, there was a restlessness. And if that weren't enough, the Germans, who were always pretty smart about things, felt that they could inspire some agitation, and they would send propagandists into Russia to make it look like, for instance, Alexandra, who was of German descent, to make it look like she was aiding the Germans quietly and defeating the Russian effort. See? And with that sort of building momentum, things got to the point where Nicholas was convinced that he should abdicate the throne. He was convinced that if he abdicated the throne in such a way that someone more competent, perhaps, or more beloved than he was, could take over, then Russia could achieve a victory and a patriotic sense would return to the country. The food was still a problem, but that was his great hope. Instead, he returned shorn of power by his own choice, yes, but the decline from being an autocrat and completely powerful to being relatively zero was humiliating. He returned home, and he and his wife and his 5 children were under house arrest for a number of months, and then the humiliation increased, and they were put on a train early in one morning, and they were taken out to the famous place. Russians always talk about the Ural Mountains. There's an invasion of the French. The Germans, they always talk about the Ural Mountains. It's like a third of the way across the huge Russian Empire. If you go to the Ural Mountains, any invader is going to be tired before he can get there. So you win just by going to the Urals. So Nicholas was, with his wife and 5 children, was taken to the Urals with the retainers. After that, step by step, their situation became coarser and coarser. Their guards became coarser and coarser. And finally, their final walk of martyrdom was in a house which was so shameful for those who came afterward that it was torn down. In other words, the powers that be that were in charge of that event destroyed the house, so its memory was obliterated. So what did happen? Well, the family was taken to the basement. It was in the middle of the night. This became a favorite Soviet tactic. In the middle of the night, probably they were dazed. They sat and they stood. Some of them were sitting. And the soldiers came in and announced that it was the decision of the Soviet that they be executed. And before Nicholas could say more than what, he was shot. Now, why do we consider the event to be universal? Because he had many chances of escape, at least initially. He had many times when he could have perhaps have squirreled his monies and his options of power, could have established this. We see it all the time. He could have found a way out. But he didn't want to. He wanted to stay, and he also wanted to indicate that his position wasn't just political, that he was the head of an empire which at the time was more than 99% of one religion, it's Christianity. And as the events marched month by month until the night in the basement room, this Christianity became more and more evident. It became the one thing that cemented the family and kept them from going absolutely insane with terror and the realization of where they were headed, because it was clear they knew where they were headed. The soldiers, the guards, who were assigned to watch them became always softened bit by bit, helplessly by the measure of the government. The soldiers who actually had contact with his family were so impressed by them that they became kind. And so how did the regime deal with it? They kept switching them out so that they could retain that coarse behavior. We celebrate the event 100 years later. None of us was alive at the time. We celebrate the event because we think of it as a Christian event, as a path of Christianity. In other words, a martyrdom, which perhaps initially people would think was a political event, but was actually symbolic of something more like 2,000 years. And if one looks at the title for this event in Russian, it has to do with the journey to Golgotha. And the amazing thing is that Christianity can be very pleasant, and lots of smiles, and lots of kisses, and well-dressed people. But remember, if the founder walked the path of the cross, then eventually those who believed in him would also walk the path of the cross. Because of our conviction that Nicholas and Alexandra and their 5 children walked this way so worthily, we give them the highest title of martyr. And to mark that, we offer you some beautiful music. We hope if the words haven't meant much to you, perhaps the music will remain in your memory. It's always going to be beautiful. But perhaps this evening or tomorrow, something will come back to you and you'll think, there was a lot going on, and perhaps it will ennoble any and all of us. Thank you.